Hello, everyone. This is the Asian American Herald, a new media network that airs live via live stream on Facebook twice a week. I'm Himani Gupta Carlson, host of the Thursday evening show. So I'd like to open our show tonight with a weekly tribute to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, who are the original caretakers of much of upstate New York, where the Asian American Herald is based. And in making this tribute, I'd like to acknowledge myself as a settler on the land, and I thank the Haudenosaunee for offering me shelter. So tonight, I am delighted to have New York Assembly member Zohran Mamdani as guest. Mamdani was born in Uganda and moved to New York City with his parents, Ugandan scholar and political commentator Mahmoud Mamdani, and Indian-born filmmaker Mira Nair, at the age of 7. He grew up attending New York City public schools, and I learned recently founded the first cricket league in the public schools at that time. And he earned a bachelor's degree from Bowdoin College. He has worked as a foreclosure prevention counselor, as well as a hip hop artist and an all-around advocate for the underserved. He is now a member of the New York State Assembly, having been elected in 2020 and having actually accomplished the formidable task of defeating an incumbent. So, Assemblyman Mamdani, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much, Emily. It's lovely to be with you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. So I really have to start by admitting that I'm a huge fan of your mother. And when I started researching you last night, I just flipped when I found out who your mother was. I have probably seen the film Mississippi Masala 24 times. I use it in a global U.S. history course that I teach. I've used it in many other courses over the years. And I was actually excited to learn that the house in Uganda where the film is set is actually your family home.
Yes.
And that was very kind of illuminative for me. So I wanted to actually start there a little bit. You have had the experience of being born in Uganda to a parent who was Indian, as well as a parent who was Ugandan, and of being raised in the United States. And so I was wondering if you could maybe just tell us a little bit about that binational, bicultural, and I think even bi-religious upbringing. How did that shape your childhood and your perspective of the world?
I think it's in many times it's actually even tried because India, Uganda, moving to New York City, and
Right.
feeling at home in each of those places, and yet in each of those places having to fight for the validation of that feeling of belonging. And it is one that, in my youth especially, I would say it was very difficult and frustrating to have to prove my belonging, sometimes on a daily basis. And yet it is one that, in retrospect, and this is something that my father told me, is that when you are a minority in whatever society, you're able to see past the rhetoric of the majority and see the truth of what is actually happening in society. Because to live on the margins is to understand the true terms and conditions of any place. And that is something that has allowed me to understand the facts as opposed to the fiction that is told oftentimes about every which place that we call home. And so, for me, I would say all three of these places are home. New York City is home to me. Kampala is home to me. New Delhi is home to me. These are places that I have family. These are places that I have history. And these are places, all of which I have hopes and I have dreams. But it has been something that I would not trade for the world. And, sadly, at this point, I'm only able to go back to Kampala once every year, 2 years, India about the same. But I stay in close contact with my family.
Yeah, it's so interesting to actually have that background and, to be able to come to an age where you would appreciate it. Were there points where you wished it weren't so confusing or weren't so kind of layered?
Absolutely. There were many, many points. There were many points. I mean, I'm an Indian Ugandan Muslim who grew up in New York City with an Iranian name. And so it doesn't fit very neatly into any one box. And growing up, especially in this city, you're trying to find a way to explain who you are and where you come from in a manner that's understandable to your fellow seventh graders or your fellow freshmen in high school. And none of my identities, none of my histories are easily explainable. There are histories that are born out of, histories of migration
Yeah.
and complexity, and there's no simplicity to these histories. And so I would try and simplify them. I would try and really, put my name into a framework and put my life into a framework that I saw around me. And in many ways, tried to make myself smaller so that I could fit into other people's conceptions of the world. And I knew, especially in high school, I had a real tough time early on with being proud of who I was and proud of where I came from. And I found that all of these other identities were so much easier to understand. And especially when I looked around and saw the way in which whiteness had no box for it to fit in. You
Yeah.
could be anything, you could be anyone. And here I was trying to just explain the name of the box that I had to live in. And so that was definitely a time in which I wanted to be of a different place, of a different name, of a different color. And yet in the years since then, I've become so thankful and so proud, and so sure of who I am and where I'm from, and that my belonging is for me to determine and not for others to decide.
Yeah. That's really, really awesome. And it's really beautifully put. It makes me wonder, was there a point where, was there kind of like a moment where you realized all the pieces fit and you were all of these things and that was a good thing?
I think that it's hard to pinpoint an exact moment, but I would say the general time period was in college when I
Yeah.
became a lot more confident about that aspect of my life. And I think that part of it came from the classes that I took. I was a major in Africana studies, and I was, being taught by teachers who were unabashed about their interests in many ways the margins of the world, as told by Western scholarship.
Yeah.
And I also think that, in college, I fell in love, and that was also a time when I was comfortable being myself because I knew that my then partner was in love with the person that I at times was struggling with being. And I think that I also co-founded my school's first Students for Justice in Palestine.
Oh,
And doing that and the radical work that is required to stand up for Palestinians, something that I continue to do to this day, and the way in which it informed my relationship to power and made me understand that, in fact, proximity to power through identity, proximity to power through history, it is not something that helps you, it is something that hurts you, because then you cannot see power for what it is. And looking from the margins vis-a-vis my identities helped me to understand the scale of the issue that we were fighting and the scale of the problem when it came to Palestine, when it came to so many other issues.
yeah. That's a very, very important thing to note. I don't want to dwell on your famous parents too much, tempting as that might be, but I do want to ask you, how much did the kind of writing that your father does and the kind of intellectual work that your father does and the kind of creative work that your mother does, how much did that kind of inform how you started to kind of like think about power and think about seeing things from the margins? And
Sorry, Himani, I've lost you.
oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
I can. There's a bit of a lag,
Okay.
but I can hear you.
Okay. We'll deal with the lag and hopefully it will catch up. I was curious about how much did the kind of intellectual and political writing that your father does, coupled with the kind of creative work that your mother does in her filmmaking, inform inform you and help you kind of address things that you had addressed really eloquently, such as power and seeing the world from the perspective of the margins. How much of a role did your parents play in that?
They played a massive role. They really opened my eyes to the way that I see the world. I wouldn't see the world in the way that I do if it wasn't for them. And I think that one thing that would really bring together their two sets of work is that in many ways it is storytelling and telling the stories of those that state and those that the powerful sought to ignore and erase, whether it be through an analysis of the political and material realities of any society, or through the stories of those who live those realities. And I think that in growing up with my parents and having these two wonderful people as my parents, it was very much helpful for me to understand that the value of certain stories, the value of certain people, you cannot look to those in power to understand that value or to gauge that value. That value comes from something else. And I think additionally, both of my parents have been quite successful in their work. And so I never had to grow up with any worries about so much of my, upbringing or, my material conditions. And my parents always made it clear to me that their success and the financial consequences of that success and their ability to provide for me was not because of their unique deservingness of those things, but that their success happened in spite of the systems that they were fighting against in their own individual ways, and that I should never confuse those two things, and that I should always understand that there is still, as long as there are others who are not afforded the same comforts, then there is still a fight to be fought.
Ah, awesome. Very good. So on those lines, you ran for the state assembly as a socialist Democrat during a time of real challenge. New York, and particularly areas such as your district in Queens, was really in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. There were protests over police brutality erupting everywhere. And there were supporters of the former president who were, maybe faced with what they saw was writing on the wall, were trying to kind of paint Democrats as socialists and socialists as evil. And I'm just kind of wondering how those factors shaped your candidacy and the kinds of messages you communicated to voters. And how did you campaign? I've had a lot of candidates on my show over the past year, and a lot of people have talked about the struggles of campaigning during a pandemic.
Absolutely. So I think one of the most refreshing things for me about our campaign was that I truly believed in everything that I stood for and continue to stand for. And what I really love about having run a race as candidly and as honestly as we did is that there are no surprises in my stances as an assemblyman today, because they're all directly connected to the platforms that we were fighting for throughout the campaign. And so when we said during the campaign that we believed that policing that NYPD needed to be defunded and that social services needed to be refunded, and now I'm saying it today, it's not a massive gap. It's not a surprise. It's not a betrayal to any voter or any constituent. And so many of the main battles that I have been fighting in this legislative session, battles around progressive taxation, battles around for the fossil fuel industry, battles around criminal justice, these are all battles that we had flagged and highlighted as we ran the campaign. And so there's that real sense of honesty in the relationship with the constituency. And that is something that I've really appreciated. Because I think that there's a lot of disagreement that is based on communication, and then I think there's a lot of disagreement that is sincere. And it is my intention to always be clear and communicative with my constituency, and where there are disagreements, to be clear that these are disagreements based on different sets of convictions, and being open about those things. And I've been so with my constituents about whatever issue may be on the agenda of the day. In the campaign, it was very interesting because I was endorsed by New York City Democratic Socialists of America. I am a proud socialist, and I made no bones about it, and have not in the past and will not in the future. And in our campaign and in our campaigns prior, the way in which we win is by door knocking, is by amassing a real army of volunteers and going door to door across the district to talk to voters about our campaigns and our candidates. And when COVID hit, it was the middle of March last year, and it really, obviously, it changed the entire world for everyone. And as a campaign, it also changed our entire understanding of how we could campaign and how we would win this campaign. And for us, overnight, we had to say goodbye to door knocking. We had to say goodbye to our path to victory.
Yeah.
And in its place, there were many stumbles and many obstacles, but eventually where we arrived at was a place where we did serious phone banking of our neighbors. But again, phone banking is difficult and different from canvassing because phone banking costs money for every call. And phone banking is less effective in that you're not face to face with someone. The interaction is far less memorable. People can hang up much quicker. But we supplemented that with handwritten postcards. We supplemented that with chalking on sidewalks, with signs, with getting into a friend's car that had a sunroof and standing there with a megaphone and telling the people of the district with 2 weeks left, this is what we're fighting for. This is why we need you to come out and vote for me. And, we supplemented it with the early weeks of June when COVID was in a different phase and you could socially distant canvass, wearing a mask and gloves and going to the park and talking to voters face to face. And we also supplemented it by ensuring that our campaign lived our values. And what that means is that we set up mutual aid operations out of our campaign and sought to feed our neighbors who needed help over the course of Ramadan and the rest of the campaign, rather.
Okay, awesome. So very much of a kind of giving back as a kind of a building a network of reciprocity in a lot of ways.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I'm curious. I really liked the way that you've talked about how the things that you're fighting now in the legislative session directly connect to the messages that you were communicating during the campaign. But a lot of the art of getting legislation passed ultimately means making compromises and maybe settling for things that are a little bit short of what you actually really want or what you really stand for. How has that? How have you experienced that in this first session so far?
Well, I think it's a very good point, and it's very true. There's a lot of compromise in legislation. There's a lot of compromise once you become an elected official. In fact, the very act of becoming an elected official is an act of compromise because you're legitimizing the state and you're working on behalf of it. What I would say is that too often in Albany, we talk about do not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. But we often paper over what is unacceptable and call it the good. We fetishize compromise above all else. We arrive at it at the first juncture as opposed to at the last juncture. And so if you start the conversation at a point of compromise, where you end is a point of concession. And I think it's very important that we have legislators who are willing and able to say that what I'm fighting for is actually exactly what my constituents need. What I'm fighting for is really already outlined right now. These are not hypothetical pie in the sky concepts. If we do not fund it at this level, people will go hungry, people will become homeless. And too often we start the bargaining at half of the need or a quarter of the need or any kind of fraction of the need. And so I'm willing to make compromises. I'm not willing to make wholesale concessions. And I think that the two are separate. And I think for too long we've called the latter the former. And to be truthful, we have to start calling the former the latter.
Yeah. So I understand you were at the rally outside the state capitol that took place last March in the wake of the Atlanta spa shootings. And I was there too. And I was there for a while. I didn't stay for quite the whole thing because I had to go on to other things. But one of the underlying messages that really struck me from the event was the fact that even while Asian American political participation has been increasing in the form of voting and in the form of organizing, the actual representation of Asian Americans in political positions is lacking. And I was wondering, how has that factor made itself felt for you as the first man of partial South Asian descent to be elected to the assembly?
Yeah, and I would say I have full South Asian descent because my
Okay, cool.
father's family many hundreds of years ago came over from Gujarat.
That's true. Yeah.
As the first South Asian man elected to any office in New York City, as the first South Asian in the New York State Assembly, man, that is, it is front and center for me on a daily basis as to the fact that my colleagues have not seen or worked with anyone who looks like me before. And I think that what is very critical is that we do not make any bones about our demands, and that we do not simply celebrate when politicians, deign to utter our names or a few chosen words from our languages and consider it to be, the end of the fight. And I think for too long we've simply been thankful to be noticed. And I think that there is a different feeling in the air today, and that is not simply a sense of gratitude, but a demand for what we are owed. And I think it's very important, it's very timely. I think that we will see far more South Asian representation in politics soon. And what's really exciting to me is that the South Asian politicians, many of them, across New York City, are fighting without making any bones about what it is that they seek to achieve. I think specifically of Jasleen Kaur, is a young Sikh Punjabi woman running for city council in Eastern Queens. And she is very clearly a working class woman fighting for a working class vision. And she grounds that in the communities that she comes from. And I think it's critical that when we elect South Asian representation, these are South Asians that are fighting for the values that we grew up with, and those values are values of inclusion, they're values of solidarity, because too often there are those who look exactly like us who build political careers on the fundamentals of exclusion and the fundamentals of supremacy, frankly. And I say that referring directly to the BJP and to how much support there is of the BJP in the diaspora here across the United States. Himani, I'm so sorry, but I sadly will have to leave after this question because I only have until 6. I can buy a couple more minutes, but I just wanted to flag that for you.
Okay. In that case, I want to go to hip hop.
Please.
I was really excited and pleased to discover that you had this stint as Mr. Cardamom, a rapper whose works address the voicelessness of the working poor and others who might be termed underserved. And so I was wondering, I'm going to make this into a 2-part question just so I can get the whole thing in. First, what led you to do this work in hip hop? And, to what extent do you see hip hop as a community building force? It's often been seen as a force that could mobilize for change. And so I'm wondering, what do you see your role in hip hop to that extent? And, what led you to that work in the first place?
Yeah, I think my role in hip hop now is not really a role of presence because I've hung up that time in my life at this point. I would say that I think that hip hop, like any art form, is in many ways the art of storytelling, and its history, in the Bronx and New York City, is a history of really telling the stories of those that society has left behind, specifically Black people. And all of us who have inherited this amazing history, it is important for us to acknowledge that and for us to understand that where this came out of and is very critical to us understanding our place in it. For me, my journey as a rapper began in Kampala in Uganda with someone named Abdul. He's a good friend of mine. He's like a brother of mine. The two of us actually started rapping together, and I only joined him at his encouragement because he was going to make music. And so the two of us made a lot of music together. And then when I came back to New York City, I rapped, solo as Mr. Cardamom. I made a song named Nani. And I think that the music that I tried to make, the intention behind it was to tell a story that I wasn't seeing told around me, but to do so without a sense of overwhelming self-seriousness, and one that acknowledged the absurdities of life and also played with the fantastical ideas of what life could be if we really took contradictions and put them on the page as heavily as we could. I think that it is, in many ways also, I would say that not simply the act of making music, but also the practice of sharing that music is very much tied to the work that I do as a politician, the work that I did as a candidate. Before I was on the Astoria Boulevard platform talking to my neighbors about my run for state assembly, I was on that platform 1 year prior shooting the music video for Nani. Before I was knocking on to talk about our campaign and our fight for energy and justice and housing for all, I was going in public transit vehicles in Kampala trying to sell a mixtape with my brother. So once you are a rapper trying to get people's attention to tell a story that they might not have the time or interest in when you first approach them, it really does prepare you for being a candidate who's trying to do exactly the same thing, and yet it's the story that you're telling is just as it is then. You're telling them, this is my story, this is also your story, and this is why I need to steal 2 minutes of your time, and I hope that you listen to it. I sadly have to run off now, Himani, but it has been such a pleasure to speak with you, and I'm very honored to be on your show.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope that we have an opportunity to have you on the show again. And I would like to just thank everyone for joining us this evening for our weekly Asian American Herald show. Once again, I'm Himani Gupta Carlson, and I've been speaking with New York State Assemblyman Zohran Mamdani. The Asian American Herald is a Facebook-based news media outlet dedicated to discussing topics and building community among Asian Americans in New York and beyond. Please look for a recording of this show on our Facebook page as well as our YouTube channel. Have a good evening, and we will see you all again next Thursday. And thank you so much, Zohran, for joining us tonight.
You're so welcome. Have a lovely day.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.